Welcome to this special Indigenous Voices edition of the Salt and Light Hour. I'm Deacon Pedro. Most Canadians woke up on the morning of May 28, 2021, to the news that 215 unmarked graves were found at a former residential school in Kamloops, British Columbia. This news was a wake-up call for all Canadians to a reality that Indigenous people live with every day. I'm not ignorant to this country's history with regards to Indigenous people, nor of our Catholic Church's history with the first people of this land. But as conversations about healing and reconciliation took center stage, I wanted to know more. I wanted to speak with Indigenous people. I wanted to hear their stories of the people and the land, stories about traditions and legends, stories about languages and cultures that I know very little about. And so, this is what we're doing today and over the course of the year. Welcome to this special Salt and Light Hour series, Indigenous Voices. Canadian Catholic bishops began this journey some 7 years ago when the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was released. The commission dealt mainly with the residential schools and its legacy, a legacy that is being lived by so many survivors and their descendants. Since then, much good work has been done and many good relationships have been formed, but there is still much to be done. And so this is where my journey begins, as a Catholic, as a Canadian, to understand where we've been, where we're at, and where we should be going as faithful Catholics. It is my hope that as we meet my guests and listen to their stories, our hearts will be opened in a way that will lead to true healing and true reconciliation, for we are all in need of both. One of the first conversations I had was with Harvey McCue. Harvey is Anishinaabe from Georgina Island First Nation and has an accomplished career in health education, self-governance, public relations, and economic development. He is the former Director of Education Services for the Cree School Board in Northern Quebec and former First Nations Director General of Indian Education at Indian and Northern Affairs Canada. We spoke about growing up on Georgina Island just off the coast of Barrie on Lake Simcoe, about land rights, about his uncle's experiences as residential school survivors, and finally, his thoughts on reconciliation.
My name is Harvey McCue. My Anishinaabe name is Wabagijig, which in English means gray skies. I was born in 1944 in Toronto and lived with my mother and my grandmother for 3 years in Toronto. My father died of tuberculosis when I was 8 months old in 1945. And so the two women raised me until my mother remarried, which she did in 1947. And it was a challenge for any single mother in those days, in the 30s, 40s, and 50s in Canada and in Ontario, because the children's aid authorities frowned upon single women with children. And so the two women were very assiduous. They managed to stay one step ahead of the Children's Aid Society in Toronto, and we lived in a variety of basically two-room apartments until my mother remarried, and she married Harold McCue, my stepfather, who was a member of the Georgina Island First Nation. Okay. And in 1947, we relocated from Toronto to the island, and at that time, my stepfather applied for the position of caretaker of one of our reserves islands in Lake Simcoe, Snake Island, which had been land had been surveyed and leased principally to Toronto people who were interested in building small summer cottages there. And the community felt that they needed a presence on Snake Island, because Snake Island had been abandoned in the late 1800s in favor of the larger Georgina Island, which had more land and more arable land in particular. And so there wasn't anyone from the community on Snake Island, and the community felt it was important to have someone there to remind cottagers that, hey, this isn't your land, this is our land.
Yeah.
So my stepfather applied and got the job of caretaker, and that's where I was raised. I was raised on Snake Island, which is part of our reserve, and I lived there until I left home in '64 to go to university.
So when you were growing up, it was a reserve, and is it still a reserve?
It's still a reserve.
Yep.
Although there isn't anyone any longer from the community living there. My niece and son inherited our property and home, but they only use it as a summer property as well. So
okay,
Snake Island is still part of the reserve, and it just lacks a permanent occupant from the community.
It sounds like from the time you were young, growing up, you were already being influenced by issues of land rights. And tell me a little bit about that.
Well, Pedro, in the 50s, when I started going to public school, there wasn't much information or education about Indian issues at the time. I mean, we mainly because all reserves in Canada during the 20s, 30s, 40s, and right up through until the early 60s, every community was governed by an Indian agent.
Right.
And this individual basically was an autocrat. Indian agents, and they were all men, white men. A lot of them were ex-military. They had total control over what happened on any reserve under their authority, and the federal government still had a very, very heavy hand in what happened and what didn't happen in communities. Right up until the 50s, it was still against the law for Indians to have legal representation, for example. Yeah. It was then, and it still is, virtually impossible for an Indian to get a loan from a bank, which meant people couldn't start businesses because they couldn't access capital, unlike other people in small towns and villages in the country, and so. We being First Nations people, we were under a real blanket. As your listeners and viewers may not know, we were prevented from organizing politically right up until the 50s. And so there was no voice. There was no national voice. There was no provincial voice. There was beyond the local chief and council. There was no voice for our people to say, hey, what's going on here? Why isn't this happening? Why is that happening? And even if we did have a voice, the local Indian agent controlled the volume on that. Any correspondence, for example, between a community and the Minister of Indian Affairs of the day had to be approved by the local Indian agent. And if the Indian agent didn't like the tenor of the letter or the accusations or the requests, the letter didn't go through.
Yeah.
So communities were really under the thumb of the government through the office and authority of Indian agents, and that really limited discourse. It limited the flow of information and the exchange of information. So when you reference land issues, people didn't think about that.
Right.
because it just wasn't, it was beyond our authority, it was beyond our control. And quite frankly, during the late 1800s, right up until probably the late 30s and early 40s, Indian agents were selling land in many cases illegally.
Mm-hmm.
Because people didn't have access to the normal ordinary authorities like the police, for example.
Right.
Communities were really held hostage by these guys, and not all of them were crooks. Not all of them were selling Indian land under the table, but it did happen, and it's been verified, and
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course.
so
I mean,
so our consciousness was really pretty minimal at that
mm-hmm.
time, and it was largely because of the suppression we were under, either by the government through Indian agents, or by the church authorities.
Right. Yeah, and I know it's a complicated thing, and we could probably spend a few hours talking about the Indian affairs and the Indian Act. But I wanted to ask you about going to school. You mentioned going to public school. You were living in an Indigenous community. Was your public school mostly Indigenous, or were you integrated with other white kids in the community?
Because Snake Island is small, and because we were the only family after 1947 who lived there year round, the cottagers came and went on Victoria Day and Labor Day. I was required to go to school on the mainland.
Okay.
And when I started school in 1950, I went to a 2-room rural school, and I was the only Indigenous kid in the school. And fortunately, my mother always read to me and to my siblings. I have 3 younger siblings, and research clearly points out that if children are read to from a very early age, their literacy and skills increase substantially over those kids who are not read to.
Right.
So by the time I got to grade 1, there was no kindergarten in the school. Kindergarten didn't really exist very, very much in the province in the 50s.
Mm-hmm.
I could read.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew my alphabet, and so because of my vocabulary and because of my ability to read, I did well in public school.
Right.
In fact, I have clear memories in grade 3 of the teacher using me as an assistant to tutor the 2 or 3 kids in grade 3 who were having trouble reading, and so I enjoyed school. I was the oldest kid at home, and my brothers were considerably younger than me. So school was great. I had playmates there. And I didn't have any problems doing schoolwork, and I was particularly feisty as well. So it was a very positive experience. I was the only Indigenous kid in the school, and if anything, I suffered reverse discrimination.
Right. Okay.
Everyone wanted to be my pal.
Okay.
I was like a novelty in the school, and so I have very happy memories of elementary and high school for that matter.
And you went on to university and postgraduate school as well. Did you have any relatives who had residential or day school experiences?
Yes, I did. I had two uncles who went to the residential school in Chapleau, Ontario, and curiously, Georgina Island was one of several Southern Ontario communities who were untouched by residential school. The community that my mother came from, Rama, near Aurelia, I don't know if there was anyone from that community who went to residential school, and I don't know why, but why those people from those two communities at least weren't affected. But certainly my two uncles went, and no one knows really why they went from Georgina Island. They were the only two in the whole history of the reserve who went to residential school, and they were taken away when they were 8 and 6. And because Chapleau is quite a distance from southern Lake Simcoe, they didn't return home until they were 16 and 18, and so they were away for 10 years,
Right.
and they were unfortunate individuals. They really suffered greatly from their experience in Chapleau.
It's again a complicated issue, and I know we can't do full justice to it, but can you share with our listeners a little bit about the kinds of things that your uncles would have experienced that might have resulted in them having a difficult life afterwards?
Well, I think like all residential school kids, the two men suffered unimaginably from the lack of love. They were and they weren't all the kids who went to residential schools suffered for a want of maternal or paternal love.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very devastating effect. Now they were in my opinion, and we were close to one of them. One Corbett lived with us off and on for almost 10 years. He helped my stepfather as a laborer, and so physically we were close to him, but him and his brother were similar to war veterans who had terrible experiences during the war. They didn't want to share the experiences. They weren't very forthcoming at all. Mm-hmm. about the 10 years that they spent at Chapleau. The most I got from Uncle Corbett was they were deprived of food. The food was either very meager or very bad, and I suspect it was both, given what I know about residential schools across the country. And he said that during the winter, quite often to supplement their low rations, as it were, the boys would set up snares at the back end of the property of the school and trap either rabbits or anything that they could snare as a way to supplement the meager food that they were provided. And quite frankly, Pedro, that was the most that he ever shared with me anyway, or with the family. He may have shared more with my mother, mm-hmm. Because they were fairly close. But my mother, if she did have additional information, she never shared it with me or with us. But we know that Chapleau was administered very similarly to all the other residential schools. So the difficulties that we know of in general about residential schools probably apply to Chapleau as well. I mean, it was impossible for kids to run away from, and I don't know if there were any cases of kids trying to escape from Chapleau, because it was, it was very remote, and it would have been tough for kids to try to get home from there.
And when you say that they had difficulties afterwards, do you mean they suffered addictions, or that were they married? How are their children? Do you see that intergenerational trauma that has been passed down in their experience?
One of them married late. They were both they both abused alcohol. They probably would have abused drugs if drugs had been available during the 60s and 70s. The Corbett, who married late, fathered 5 children, and their marriage dissolved after about 8 years, and all of the kids were taken up by Children's Aid Society and farmed out to foster homes, and some of those kids are damaged as well. So yeah, there was definitely evidence of intergenerational trauma. Both men were just they were they had problems communicating. They were withdrawn. As I said, they abused alcohol. They weren't. You wouldn't describe them as drunks. Like they weren't intoxicated 24/7.
Mm-hmm.
But when they had disposable income, it was spent on alcohol, and Corbett, for example, he lived with us, as I say, off and on for at least 10 years. He would just go to town on the weekend and return on sometime on Monday and in
Right.
pretty bad shape and hungover and
Right.
clothes torn and so on. So
Yeah.
yeah, they were broken people, quite
Mhm.
frankly.
Yeah.
They were. You couldn't have a conversation with them, at least beyond just sort of normal pleasantries.
Mhm.
They were unhappy, and yeah, they weren't. They weren't whole.
Yeah. The governments and churches and church leaders have offered apologies. Not sure in terms of compensation how much or certainly not enough has been done. What is needed to make this right, Harvey?
Quite frankly, Pedro, apologies and reparations are symbolic. And in my opinion, and this is my opinion only, and I'm not a clinician, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a medical person, but in my opinion, reparations and apologies are tokens, and they're important. But as far as healing is concerned and helping people deal with the trauma that they experience, I don't think any amount of money can resolve their issues. Time is required. Treatment for counseling for the children of survivors and unfortunately for the children of those children are probably is probably a step in the right direction, and I think our own communities need to step up and recognize the tremendous damage that these people have suffered and that their children have suffered. And I think communities need to explore what programs can be done within the community to offer support and assistance to these individuals, as opposed to just treating them as they are treated, just as sort of normal people. Well, they're not normal people, and they've been damaged psychologically, and so they need to be treated in ways which acknowledge that damage and which accommodates that damage. And I hope communities are looking at this as a measure of providing support. I don't know if that's happening, but I would certainly encourage it. In addition to counseling, I think communities need to develop measures to accommodate the difficulties and challenges that these people face.
Yeah, that sounds like it's an important part of the healing process. What do you think true reconciliation would look like? I know that healing is part of that. I know truth needs to be part of that. But in a perfect world, if Harvey McCue saw perfect reconciliation, what would it look like?
Well, it would be Canadians as a whole acknowledging the challenges and barriers that Indigenous people have experienced and faced since the 1800s. I believe that if Canadians as a whole were better informed about the difficulties and barriers, in many cases, legal and legislative barriers. I'm not talking about discrimination on the street and stuff like that. There would be, first of all, a greater understanding of why our communities are in conditions that they're in. And secondly, I think people would be more inclined to see a challenge to overcome to help our communities, as opposed to seeing us and our communities as being responsible for the situation that we're in. Right. I think too many Canadians, and I don't blame them because for what I'm going to say, because they just they haven't had the education or the information to make a proper assessment. But too many Canadians really do believe that we're responsible for the problems that we experience.
Right.
They say, well, and quite often I hear, well, why can't you improve yourselves? Why can't you get work? Basic things like that. Well, and so we're seen as the authors of our own misfortune, and that's as I say, that's an unfortunate lens to use in looking at Indigenous people, because it's a inaccurate lens. A lot of barriers were put in our way that prevented us from improving our conditions, from improving our education, from accessing capital, from developing businesses, from becoming part of the economy. Those were not problems that we created. We are in effect the results of those problems. We suffer because of those problems, but they were not problems that we created. And so we are far from the authors of our own misfortune. And I think if Canadians as a whole had better education about those difficulties that we faced and those barriers, I think there would be a greater and quite frankly quicker process to reconcile what happened as a result of residential schools.
And as you said, it's not an easy job, and it'll take time, but hopefully we are already moving in the right direction.
Well, I think yes, we are moving in the right direction, but I'll be quite candid. There's a long way to go. There's a long way to go. People are. For example, just as soon as we finish this, I'm delivering a book that a former student of mine wrote about residential school. Interestingly, she's not Indigenous, but the book she self-published it and it's been well received. I'm delivering it to friends that we've been with, that we've known since we've been in Ottawa since the late 80s. And these two people, they're well educated, they're university educated. The wife was a director general in the civilian side of the RCMP. They know nothing about residential schools.
Yes.
They know,
Yes.
and they're both college graduates, and that's just one of many examples. So there's a long way to go, Pedro.
Yes, and I hope that that's a little bit that we can do with this program, is just bring a more awareness and education to people.
Well, let's hope so.
Thanks to the work that you do, Harvey, as an educator. Thank you for spending a little time with us today, telling us about yourself and about what you do and about your thoughts on all of this. Thank you.
You're welcome, Pedro. Good talking to you.
Yes, you too. Speaking with Harvey McCue made it obvious that not all Indigenous people are damaged, but certainly there is a majority who did not have the opportunities that Harvey had. He is a practical man, and while he doesn't discount the importance of apologies and compensation, he recognizes the need for practical healing in the form of counseling and programs that are designed by Indigenous people specifically to treat survivors, their children, and their grandchildren. Thanks to his leadership as an educator, many communities are finding those practical solutions. Another Indigenous leader who is an example of what is possible when you do not have obstacles and instead are given opportunities is Cassidy Caron. At just 29 years of age, in 2021, she was elected president of the Métis National Council. President Caron is originally from Saskatchewan, but grew up in British Columbia. We spoke about the Métis Nation, who they are, their history, and some of the issues that have affected them over the last few centuries.
Tansei Kioel. Hello, my name is Cassidy Caron, and I am the president of the Métis National Council. My family is Métis. I come from two historic communities out in Saskatchewan. The communities are called Batoche, Saskatchewan, and St. Louis, Saskatchewan. So that's where both my grandparents were born and raised, and I was actually born and raised in British Columbia, but still had a lot of family out in Saskatchewan, and our ties to those lands are very strong. And we make many trips out west and to visit our homelands as much as possible. But growing up in British Columbia, I always knew that I was Métis. I was raised Métis. I was connected to my family and my culture and my traditions, and very fortunate to do so, because being disconnected and removed from your lands, that is one of the challenges that the Métis Nation struggles with.
You're being very humble because you are the president of the Métis National Council. You didn't start there. What made you sort of get involved in issues that eventually led you to, I mean, I don't even know how that process works. If it would have been an election or if you were appointed. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so like I said, I've been connected to the Métis community my whole life. My family was very politically involved in the Métis Nation my whole life. When I was young, I served as a community youth representative with my local community for our Métis community. And from there, I actually got involved in provincial Métis politics and was elected as the provincial youth chairperson and minister responsible for youth with Métis Nation British Columbia, which is the Métis government that represents Métis people in BC. Okay. So that was from 2016 to 2020. I took some time off and I did my master's degree in community development. And just September 30th, 2021, I was elected as the president of the Métis National Council. And so the Métis National Council is the representative body, the advocacy body for our democratically elected Métis governments in British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario. So those Métis governments represent Métis people living in those provinces, and they come together and mandate me as the president of the Métis National Council to represent their interests and needs at the national and international levels.
Okay, so I have about 50 more questions right there, but let's back up a little bit, because maybe we have some listeners that are thinking, Métis? What is that? Is that considered like in First Nations? Like who are the Métis people? What is the Métis Nation?
So Métis are one of 3 identified Aboriginal peoples recognized in Canada's Constitution Act. So Métis people are a distinct Indigenous people who emerged in the early 1800s in the historic Northwest. And so we come from originally the mixing of European fur traders and explorers and First Nations people. However, that mixing took place so long ago, and then those people came together and now have a shared history, language, culture, and collective consciousness. So the Métis Nation is one of 3 Indigenous peoples. So there's Métis, there's First Nations, and there's Inuit across Canada, and so we are the Métis Nation.
So and again, I have more questions, but so as a nation, can we say that it's equivalent to like the Cayuga Nation or the Niska Nation or so it's considered equivalent in that at a level of nations? Is that correct?
Absolutely, yes. So
Okay.
so the Métis Nation is our body, our collective consciousness of people, and we do work with the federal government on a nation to nation, government to government relationship. So yes, the Métis Nation is considered a nation.
Okay. And I think you already answered my next question, because you said that the mixing of the blood, I guess, of the Indigenous people and the Europeans happened so long ago. So because I think that there might be some people that think, oh, Métis just means mixed blood. So my friend Karen, whose mother is Ojibwe but father is Norwegian, she's not Métis, but she's mixed. So can you explain that difference a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're absolutely correct. Mixedness does not mean Métis. That mixedness, that what we call, it's a ethnogenesis of a people, dates back to the early 1800s, where the successive generations of marriages between mixed heritage children born of those European men and First Nations women facilitated throughout North America the fur trade, and led to that formation of a new distinct people and those new distinct communities. So back then, even those mixed people, those mixed communities were no longer identifiably European or First Nations, but rather something entirely new and unique, and were recognized as such by their European and First Nations neighbors alike. So typically, we were for many generations known as half-breeds, and we still refer to ourselves as half-breeds. And there are many names for Métis people in different Indigenous languages across Canada as well, just depending on whereabouts on the continent, in this country we were, and who we were trading with, who we were meeting with, who we were building relationships with. So, for example, one of the names that Cree people would call us is Otipemisiwak, which meant the people who own themselves, or the people who govern themselves. And so we were recognized, and of course today are still recognized as a distinct people.
Right. Now, you mentioned that the council represents Métis, the Métis nations of BC, did you say Alberta? I think you said Saskatchewan and Ontario, but there are Métis people all across the country, correct? Even in the East Coast.
Correct. So yes, so there are governments that are established in British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario who represent Métis people, and those people come from these historic communities. And yes, you're absolutely right. Métis people who come from our historic homeland, which was the historic Northwest, spanning from parts of Ontario, the Prairie provinces, a little bit of the United States, Northwest Territories, and into Eastern British Columbia. That's our homeland. And so if you come from there, of course, our people move around the country, and you can be a Métis person from the Métis Nation homeland who lives outside of there.
Right.
But that's where our communities are.
So when the Canadian government was enacting policies against, or policies that affected the First Nations, Indians, they would call them. Were those policies also affecting Métis people, and were Métis people seen as, I mean, you said half-breeds, but were they considered Indians in that sense?
So that was one of the things that the Métis Nation had struggled with for many, many years, was whether or not the Canadian government defined Métis people as quote unquote Indian. And so there actually was a Supreme Court case, and I'm gonna gap on the year right now, but it was the Daniels decision, which then it did come to say that Métis people are defined as Indian under the Indian Act, or not under the Indian Act. But anyways, they are defined as Indian. However, historically, yes, the colonial assimilative policies did affect Métis people, many of which, depending where you were across the homeland, were similar to our First Nations relatives. But there were also many distinct assimilative policies that applied to Métis people, including the script system, which was a process to really strip Métis people of their lands as the government was moving west and putting in the railway. They wanted to take over the lands that Métis people were traditionally living on and inhabiting and making their livelihoods on. And so the Northwest Script Commission came through the historic Northwest and really gave Métis people the option to take $240 or 240 acres of land. However, that process actually was very, very unfair, where if you took a piece of script and wanted to go and cash it in for that money, there were no banks around the area to go and to do that. So people were following through these script commissions and would buy these pieces of land or the script dollars from Métis people for much less than they were actually worth. So our people were actually they were swindled off their land, and they weren't given what they were promised as the government was coming through. And so our people have been also known as the road allowance people, and that was because they lived on road allowances. And as I say, as the government came through and were speculating the land and building the railway and settling new communities, Métis people just kept getting pushed off of where they were. And so that was one of those policies, that was one of those practices of assimilating Métis people, really just disenfranchising them of who they were and where they lived. And that led to what we call a Métis diaspora. And that's exactly what you were talking about, is that Métis people were all over the country. And that's because we didn't have anywhere to go. We weren't given the land that we were promised in the negotiations of Canada becoming Canada.
Yeah, it's fascinating, because you think that if the goal was assimilation, that the fact that these people were already mixed, that would have been a good thing. But I guess the mixing happened before Canada was even a nation. It was so messed up, so complicated. Some people, maybe some of our listeners maybe have heard about Louis Riel and those rebellions. I don't know if they know the history, but were those rebellions happening because some of these unfair policies? Like, is that what Louis Riel was rebelling against?
Yeah, and one of the things that we're trying to correct as the Métis Nation right now is actually shifting the narrative around rebellion, and actually one to resistance. And that is, if you think about the history of Métis people, the one word that is a theme throughout our history and even in today is resistance. We have always been resisting colonial and assimilative policies and processes to be able to assert our inherent right to self-determination and self-government, to a way of life that our people should be living and want to be living. And so Louis Riel was one of those people who recognized that there was a lot of unfair policies and processes where our Métis people were being left out. And so Louis Riel is certainly a leader within the Métis Nation for resisting these policies and trying to fight for Métis people to be a part of Canada, because Métis people have been instrumental in making this country what it is today. Louis Riel, for example, and his provisional government negotiated Manitoba into confederation. And while all this was happening, while all our Métis people were still trying to make sure that this was a good place to live for our Métis people to be able to continue on our livelihood as we wanted it to be, these policies and processes were really stifling the way that our people were living. And so all of that led to resistance. It led to the Northwest resistance and Louis Riel really taking up arms, first in Duck Bay, Saskatchewan, and then ending at Batoche, Saskatchewan, with the Battle of Batoche, which is where my family comes from.
Wow. Lots of history.
Mm-hmm.
Would the original Europeans that were mixing, would they have been mostly French?
There was all kinds. There was
Okay,
French, Irish, and Scottish settlers that were coming over, and some working for the Northwest Company, the trading company,
Right.
and some working for the Hudson Bay Company. So the mixing was with French, Scottish, and Irish.
The reason why I'm asking is because my sense, and from Métis people that I know, that a lot of them would have been Catholic or Christian because of that mixing. Is that fair to say? Historically,
yes. Yes and no. I mean, again, this is really something that needs to be thought through a little bit more with our communities and with the church. I mean, the colonial legacy of forced assimilation, including church-run residential schools, the 60s scoop, legislation that bans ceremonies for over half a century, has really resulted in a disconnection of many Métis from spiritual ways of our ancestors. So Métis spirituality exists on a continuum, if you were to think about it, with Christianity, especially, like you say, Catholicism on one end, and traditional Indigenous spirituality on the other. And it really blends both of those in the center. And so Métis spirituality, it does also include ceremonies, historically and contemporarily. And so it's not one or the other. It was actually quite a blend. And I think today there's so much diversity across the Métis Nation. Like I say, from British Columbia to Ontario, that's a vast amount of land. That's there's a lot of differences there, and that applies to our spirituality as well.
Yeah, I guess I was asking because I truly saw that was an opportunity for a good mix, and maybe mix is not the right word, as you said, because it's not like it's a little bit of both, but I think it's the fullness of both that creates something even greater in terms of spirituality. And I'm glad you brought up residential schools and the 60s scoop, because I was going to ask you, would those policies have affected Métis people as well? Were Métis children being sent to residential schools as well, and maybe being forced out of their families and to be adopted by other families, by white families? Was that happening as well?
Yes, absolutely. It was happening. And, there's a lot of work for us as the Métis Nation to still do. There's a major piece of work that needs to be addressed to really come to understand the full experience, or the full, I guess, history of Métis experiences at residential school. There were some 600 schools across these lands that had similar policies, but only 160 or so were those schools that were recognized by the residential school settlement agreement. So a lot of these schools were provincially run or run by different churches, and they aren't actually recognized. And a lot of those schools were the schools that our Métis people were going to. So there's a lot of work for the Métis Nation to seek out the full story of our Métis survivors and the experiences that they had. Many of our survivors today talk about being sent to the convent or being sent to a boarding school, not necessarily what what a lot of people now call a residential school,
Mhm.
but they were residential schools, and they did share the same type of assimilative policies as those that we are very familiar with today.
Yes, and I think a lot of that, I hope that everyone is trying to sort of not undo, because you can't undo the past, but move forward from it. And part of that involves this delegation that you're part of that is going to be traveling to Rome to meet with Pope Francis. What do you think about that? How important do you think that visit is or needs to be?
Yeah, so for some, it's very important, and it is for many of our residential school survivors to really bring the stories of the Métis Nation over to the Vatican, to the Pope, to create that space for our Métis survivors to tell their truths.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the most powerful things that I like to remind people of is, of course, we sit in these circles with elders and residential school survivors, and they're elderly, but the stories that they tell happen to children. And I think that's what's most important to me, is to bring those stories over to Pope Francis and share with him that these things happen to children. These injustices happened to children. And there's, like I say, there's much work ahead of us to uncover the truth of the experience of Métis residential schools, Métis residential school experiences, because before reconciliation can happen, we need truth. And so there's a lot of that work that has to take place. And we want to start, this work has started across the Métis Nation, but part of this is now bringing these stories to the Pope, bringing our survivors over there to share their truths, and to invite the Pope, invite the Catholic Church along on our journey of reconciliation and our journey of healing.
You personally, Cassidy Caron, might have the opportunity to tell something specifically to the Pope. I don't know if you've thought of that. You probably have. I don't know if you've prepared something, but what do you want to tell Pope Francis, you personally?
So me personally, yes, I will be leading our delegation of 8 over to the Vatican at the end of March. For me, I'm going to be doing all that I can to create that space for our survivors to be sharing their stories, and we're opening up that opportunity to more than the 8 people who are traveling over to the Vatican with us, and we're opening up processes so that survivors and intergenerational survivors can share their stories for us to bring over. So for me, I am going over and being the spokesperson for the Métis Nation to deliver these stories, and like I say, to share what is needed by the Métis Nation to move forward down a path towards healing, towards rebuilding, towards bringing our communities back together and healing from the tragic, destructive things that took place to our communities.
What is your hope that the Pope would respond, or if anything, what would you like him to say?
I actually hope that he doesn't have too much to say while we're over there, because shortly after I received the invitation to lead our delegation over to the Vatican, we did receive confirmation that Pope Francis will be traveling to Canada soon, within the context of reconciliation. And so when I say I hope that he doesn't have much to say there, is because I want him to say it here on these lands where these atrocities took place to our communities and to our people. One of the calls for action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report is for the Pope to deliver an apology to survivors and to their families on Canadian soil. And I truly hope that the stories that we bring will move the Pope to want to, to recognize what has taken place here, because the definition of an apology is a regretful acknowledgement of an offense or failure, and that's what the church had done. They failed our people, and so an apology will be that acknowledgement for our communities to then be able to move along on their healing journeys and to rebuild and to continue down the path of reconciliation. So that's what I hope will happen. You know, bring our survivors over there, share these stories to hopefully move the Pope to join us in this work that needs to take place for Indigenous people here in Canada.
President Caron, I think that's exactly what's going to happen. I'm with you. A lot of people are hoping for that, but I do think that's what's going to happen, and I'm excited about being part of that delegation because I'll be there as well.
Oh, great!
So, looking forward to that journey that should have begun a long time ago. I know it has begun, but it should have begun even before then, and that it might be a long journey because healing takes time, but that we can walk together. Thank you for speaking with us today and for sharing a little bit about you and your people and what you do and your thoughts about all of this with us today.
Great. Thank you so much.
President Caron was one of the delegates who traveled to Rome from March 28th through April 1st to meet with Pope Francis. Not only is she an inspiration for all Métis and Indigenous Canadians, but for all young women who seek to have a voice in leadership and in making a difference that is so much needed in this world. To learn more about all Indigenous issues, especially as they intersect with the Catholic Church, you can visit our website, slmedia.org/healing-reconciliation-journey. That is also where you can watch our coverage of the historic meetings between residential school survivors, elders, knowledge keepers, and Indigenous youth with Pope Francis. I'm Deacon Pedro. Thank you for listening. Stay tuned over the next couple of weeks as we bring you more Indigenous voices on this special featured series of the Salt and Light Hour.